Chapter 13, Training the Anaerobic and Aerobic Energy Systems. All right, we're going to look at the four principles of exercise training: overload, specificity, individual differences, and reversibility. Discuss overload principle for training the intramuscular high energy phosphates and glycolytic systems. Outline the specific adaptations in each system with exercise training. Describe how the following 5 factors affect an aerobic training program: initial fitness, genetics, training frequency, training duration, training intensity. List the 5 cardiovascular and pulmonary adaptations of aerobic training. Explain how exercise heart rate can establish the appropriate exercise intensity for aerobic training. Define a training sensitive zone. Outline a typical exercise training session for aerobic fitness improvement. Explain the need to adjust the training sensitive zone for swimming and other modes of upper body exercise. Explain the influence of age on maximum heart rate and training sensitive zone. Contrast continuous versus intermittent aerobic exercise training, including advantages and disadvantages of each. Outline 5 potential benefits and risks of exercise during pregnancy. So general training principles, you have the overload principle. This first one we talk about, which enhances, it's regular application of specific overload enhances physiological function to produce positive training response. So exercising at intensities greater than normal induces a variety of highly specific adaptations so the body functions more efficiently. We have the specificity principle, which is adaptations in metabolic and physiological systems, and these depend on the type of overload imposed and muscle mass activated. Okay, so specificity is important too. So just as strength and power training develops specific strength and power adaptations, regular aerobic activity elicits specific endurance training adaptations with no effective transfer between strength power training and aerobic training. So specificity means it encompasses activities with identical metabolic components. Said principle is the specific adaptation to imposed demands. And again, this talks really about training the muscles to do the activity you will be doing. All right, so you're not doing, if you swim and such, the carryover effect hasn't been shown to influence running. Okay, this is what it's talking about. If you're doing specific power-based things such as plyometrics, then that's going to help in vertical jump. Individual differences principle. All individuals don't respond similarly to stimulus, and this has to do with genetics. Really, it has a lot to do with a person's genotype, which is what you can't see, the alleles and things like that make up a person's traits. Okay, phenotype is something you can see. Okay, but genotype is something that still makes up that individual, and it can't be seen. So those individual differences matter. So you can't always. There are certain people that are responders, non-responders, and things like that, and that has to do with their genetics. Reversibility principle: detraining occurs rapidly when a person quits exercise regimen. For example, VO2 max decreased 25% in 5 subjects confined to a bed for 26 consecutive days. So the stroke volume decreased, cardiac output decreased, and capillaries number decreased from between 14 and 25%. Okay, which because they stopped doing the activity. So there's a transient nature of training. General training principle. This here it just talks about how healthy endurance training versus untrained men. If you look here at the data, it basically shows you that, for instance, muscle fibers, fast twitch, the untrained person has about 50% fast, 50% slow. You go and look at the trained individual, the fast twitch percentage decreases from 20 to 30%, and then the slow twitch is around 60%, which makes sense because it's endurance trained individuals are training those slow twitch muscle fiber types. Okay, so this talks exactly about the specificity and training specificity to address what you're trying to gain. What are you training? What are you trying to become? Okay, if you're trying to do resistance training and become stronger and muscular strength and things like that, you're not going to do endurance training because it's contraindicated in regards to strength. Endurance training, okay, running distance and things like that. So, and there's other things on here too that make sense. I mean, if you look at the blood volume, it increases, okay. If you look at the aerobic enzymes, they increase, okay, in the trained from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20. So you have this because of the mitochondrial volume, okay. What is okay? Look at the volume and percent muscle cell. Okay, for the volume, for the mitochondrial volume, you have it trained, it's at 8. Untrained, it's at 2.15, which makes a lot of sense. The number of mitochondria, and why is that? Because oxidative metabolism occurs there in the Krebs cycle, which is in the mitochondria. Okay, so you're going to have a higher number of mitochondria. You're going to have the mitochondrial volume is going to be higher too as well. Because cellular respiration, when you talk about it from an aerobic standpoint, that's where it takes place. So you're going to have more of those things take place in the trained versus untrained in regards to endurance trained individuals. Makes sense. Adaptations to exercise training, anaerobic system changes, increased levels of anaerobic substrates, increased quantity and activity key enzymes, controlling anaerobic phase, glucose catabolism, increased capacity to generate high levels of blood lactate, all add activities. Well, this makes sense too, okay, because after resistance training, you're going to have an increase in ATP, increase in phosphocreatine, increase in free creatine, increase in glycogen. Okay, and that's because so if you look at muscle biopsies taken before and after resistance training, they reveal the increase in trained muscles resting levels of ATP, PCR, free creatine, glycogen. It includes significant improvements in muscular strength. These all make sense relative to the specificity principle of exercise. You're talking about the training specificity. So you fast twitch muscle fibers, those increase. All right, you have an increased capacity to generate high levels of blood lactate during exercise. Why is that? Okay, well, because we have an enhanced lactate producing capacity resulting from training induced increased levels of glycogen and glycolytic enzymes. So these are things that are happening relative to the adaptations relative to training. So there are adaptations to take place. We've seen both aerobically and anaerobically based on enzymes and different types of organelles like the mitochondria and also muscle fiber type percentage. Adaptations to exercise training, aerobic system changes. You have enhancement in muscle fibers capacity to aerobically generate ATP. Okay. Increased mitochondrial size number, we talked about that. Twofold increase in level of aerobic system enzymes. Enhancement of both fiber types, existing aerobic capacity, lactate threshold. By the way, in long term in the aerobic system change, when you have endurance trained individuals, there's also an increase in so the lactate threshold. You don't hit the lactate threshold as quickly, and also you in regards to the aerobic trained individuals, you don't have the there's a lot of things that take place in the anaerobic training, for example, resistance training individuals that are opposite of the aerobic training system changes. All right, we'll talk more about that. So we have adaptations for exercise, aerobic system changes. This just again talks about how you have uh, an percent increase in aerobic enzymes, glycogen content, PCR, uh, phosphocreatine, which is the system used. We talked about, remember, ATP system. It was like one vertical jump. Then you had phosphocreatine system was up to about 12 seconds. So glycolytic capacity is up to, the glycolytic system. The anaerobic system was up to about 90 seconds. So it makes sense why these system changes are taking place relative to the training that's occurring. Okay, so all right, so percentage increase, and it's relative too. So if you look at figure 13.3, it talks here about generalized potential increase for anaerobic energy metabolism with short-term sprint power training. Adaptations to exercise, aerobic system changes. You have improvement in the ability to oxidize fatty acids, so fats are oxidized, particularly triacylglycerols that are in active muscle, so fat storage during steady rate exercise. The enhancements to capacity to oxidize carbs. Remember, we said carbs give energy about 2 times the rate of fats and proteins. Provides considerably faster aerobic transfer from energy from fat breakdown, so you get energy more quickly, and then liberates 6% more energy than fat per quantity of oxygen consumed. All right, so you're getting more out of that fat. Okay, if you have trained properly. All right, with this aerobic system. An aerobic system meaning you're doing aerobic exercise. What I'm talking about. Adaptations, exercise training. An increased heart's mass volume, greater left ventricular and diastolic volumes during rest and exercise. So this makes sense because you have left ventricular increases, and that makes sense because your heart size, you have long-term aerobic training, you have heart mass and volume with the left ventricular and diastolic volumes during rest and physical activity. Makes sense. This is one of the reasons why you have your cardiac output, which equals stroke volume times heart rate. If you have a larger stroke, okay, so more ejection for each beat is taking place. So you have this left ventricular cardiac cavity size. So your left ventricle in your heart is actually getting larger. Okay, it's interesting too because this can happen with people. This left ventricular enlargement can happen with heart disease, but in this case, it's actually based upon training adaptations, which is a good thing. Increase in plasma volume. You have an increase stroke volume at rest. So I talked about that, and during exercise. That's why the resting heart rate is lower amongst people who are endurance trained, because cardiac output basically can remain similar or even greater because the stroke volume increases even though the heart rate decreases. So people who are aerobically trained, you'll see like them about beats per minute, maybe around 50, 55 beats per minute versus someone who's sedentary with like a 70 beats per minute type of resting heart rate. And it's relative to the stroke volume. A reduction in heart rate during submaximal exercise. So it's an endurance trained individual's heart rate is less during submaximal exercise as well. Adaptations, exercise training, cardiovascular adaptations. You have an increase in max cardiac output. Cardiac output, remember, it's equal stroke volume times heart rate. Increase in the max quantity of oxygen extracted from arterial blood during exercise. So we have this arterial blood you're able to get more blood out of that, more oxygen out of that blood because you're trained. You've become aerobically trained. An increase in muscle blood flow during max exercise. Okay. We have the plasma volume, by the way, for training. It increases up to about 20%. Okay, so that increases enhances circular and thermoregulatory dynamics to facilitate oxygen delivery to muscles during physical activity. And a decrease in systolic and diastolic blood pressures at rest and submaximal exercise. In fact, systolic pressure, they've actually seen decrease about up to 10 millimeters of mercury at rest for about 12 hours after this endurance training. Okay, so these are noted effects. Right here, this is just the same thing. It's based on the figure 13.6. It's adaptations cardiovascular function with aerobic training, increase oxygen delivery to active muscles. What you see, what takes place here is you have this increase in plasma volume, increased red blood cell mass, total volume increase, and some of the other things you have. And ejection fraction, I talked about that, stroke volume, max output, max cardiac output. You have more oxygen coming out of the blood, okay, more blood flow to active muscle. Adaptations exercise, pulmonary. So with the pulmonary adaptations, you have you have increased ventilatory muscle endurance, decreased lactate accumulation from increase in aerobic enzyme levels. So you have improvements in max oxygen uptake with training, increase the max minute ventilation. This improvement in the ability to sustain high levels of submaximal ventilation. Okay, that's what happens with this endurance training, and even anaerobic training. Okay, but again, a lot of it has to do with what are you training for, and the ability to when you measure these things in the lungs, the pulmonary adaptations. Most oftentimes, you're looking at the aerobic training that induces these pulmonary dynamics. And then you have a reduction in ventilatory equivalent for oxygen and submaximal exercise. Talk about that again. You submax, you're still you're getting fatigued less quickly. Okay. And then it frees oxygen from respiratory muscles by non-respiratory active muscles. So oxygen is basically being freed by things that are not being used in the body. So it's becomes more efficient. For example, if you have exhaled air of a trained individual contains only 14 to 15% oxygen during submaximal exertion, yet an untrained person's expired air contains about 17% oxygen at the same intensity. So you're talking about the exhaled air containing less oxygen in the trained subject's breath. So that means that they're keeping more of that oxygen within the system. Adaptations, exercise training, blood lactate concentrations, decrease in blood lactate, and an increase in exercise intensity before the onset of OBLA. Okay, onset of blood lactate accumulation. You see here post training that oxygen consumption basically is it has the liter per minute. You have it takes longer for OBLA to occur, okay, with trained individuals, and the lactate, excuse me, the lactate basically for pre-trained individuals starts more quickly, okay, and it's because you're able to these trained individuals aerobically use fats more efficiently until there is a need to use that lactate, which is the carbohydrate, okay. And that's because the lactate accumulation occurs as intensity of activity occurs, but that's relative of the person's training level. Adaptations, exercise training, body composition changes. For overfat or borderline overfat people, regular aerobic exercise reduces body mass and body fat. Okay, so the thing with aerobic training that's great is that it has a lot to do with it's body fat maintenance, okay, weight maintenance with aerobic, and then anaerobic, you talk about fat-free mass maintenance occurs with resistance training. So you may not lose weight if you're lifting weights, okay, but it's because you're building fat-free. It's because Weight training is you're maintaining fat-free mass, so it's not a bad thing. Okay, exercise only, exercise combined with calorie restriction reduces body fat more than fat loss with only dieting. So obviously, the best way to lose weight is to do cardiovascular activity, aerobic training, okay, which deals with weight maintenance and calorie burn. It deals with resistance training because you're burning fat in the moment while you're working out, and your resting metabolic rate's going up for the next day, let's say, or two, when your body's is burning energy to repair those muscle fibers you broke down through weight training. Okay, and then your fat-free body mass is going up basically being maintained. So you might not lose weight, but you're still gaining fat-free mass. And then your caloric restriction is going to cause you to also lose weight. So you have to think about, and we talked about, how much that causes per week. If you have a deficiency of 500 kilocalories per week, okay, how much that is decreasing the effects of the weight gain, okay, when you're restricting calories. So there's a combined way to do this where the best way to do it is through cardiovascular activity, anaerobic activity, weight training, and then also a healthy diet with less calories in versus than you had before. Adaptations, exercise training, temperature regulation. So well-hydrated, aerobically trained people are able to exercise in hotter environments because they have larger plasma volume, more responsive to thermoregulatory mechanisms, and about, like I said, about 20%. We had the plasma volume 20% more. You have more blood flow going through the body, which gets oxygen to the tissues more effectively. Trained men and women dissipate heat faster and more effectively than untrained. So that's why they say that people who are trained don't sweat quite as much, oftentimes, when compared with people that are sedentary or untrained. And then for trained individuals, metabolic heat generated by exercise poses less of a detriment to exercise performance and overall safety. Okay, so even if they are hot, the heat doesn't affect them quite as badly. Adaptations, exercise training, endurance performance. Enhanced endurance accompanies the physiological adaptations of training. Regular exercise, aerobic resistance produce psychological benefits regardless of age. I'm glad we talked about this a little bit because basically you have the aerobic activity, by the way, it stimulates the parasympathetic nervous response, which has been known to increase cognition, and it's this rest and relax response. So, you have, and then you have anaerobic activity has been known, research has shown, to decrease anxiety. One of the things about it is that studies have been done in regards to, well, first of all, exercise is more like, it's like taking a little bit of Prozac, because Prozac affects the neurotransmitter serotonin, and it upregulates the serotonin, or it's a serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor, so it keeps it where the serotonin is basically in the system, which causes serotonin is something, the neurotransmitter that causes people to feel less anxious. And then also you have, they say exercise also a little bit of Ritalin, because it increases dopamine, which is effective in increasing focus. So you have these things that are taking place that are psychologically beneficial. Then there's the thing of beta endorphin release, which is something that's released during distance running that causes people to have this exercise high. And then there's another thing called other things like endogenous cannabidiols, things like anandamide that are released as well, that cause this opioid type effect to the body, where it's a naturally releasing, our body naturally releases it. So and then BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor, which is something that deals with neurogenesis, building nerve cells in the brain that cause people to be able to function more effectively. Okay, so there's a huge cycle, and this is a relatively new area of study where they've been looking at the effects of exercise in what the benefits are. Factors affecting aerobic training response: initial level. So if you have initial level of cardiovascular fitness, you're not going to show so much of a huge change in improvement. Training frequency: general training response occurs. Exercise about the response occurs with exercise performed at least 3 times a week for 6 weeks. Duration: general, basically performing less exhaustive, moderate paced exercise, about 30 minutes each session, establishes this realistic exercise duration recommended for the average person. Training intensity: generally 50 to 55% of VO2 max or 70% heart rate is a minimal threshold stimulus for cardiovascular improvement. And exercise intensity represents the most critical factor for successful aerobic training. Couple things about this is that cardiovascular demands must reach an intensity to sufficiently increase or overload the stroke volume and cardiac output. And cardiovascular overload must activate sport-specific muscle groups to enhance local circulation of muscles' metabolic machinery. So simply stated, to improve, runners must run, cyclists must cycle, rowers must row, and swimmers must swim. So you use what you have, and you have to, use what you have and train to what it is you're trying to do. So if you're not doing sport specific training, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you're not training for the sport or activity or competition you're trying to do better at. Okay. One of the things they said is that they've shown is that people who actually do resistance training, it's actually helped long distance running. Long distance runners have become stronger because of resistance training, weight training. However, when you're looking at strength, distance running does not help strength, because you figure it's focusing on a different type of exercise regimen. So you're not training to do explosive type things. You're not training to do resistance exercise. You're training to do you should be training to run distance. And so if you're trying to lift weights and get stronger, and your strength is trying to improve, you shouldn't really be doing a whole lot of distance running and far distance activities, because you're actually decreasing testosterone and human growth hormone and things like that. Okay, optimal training intensity. One of the things I want to talk about is that weight loss should really happen to lose weight. You really should be working out at about 60 minutes a day. The CDC for adults said 30 minutes or more, but that's a very conservative estimate. It really should be about 60 minutes a day of physical activity to provide optimum health benefits, and sets the lower limit for optimal duration to achieve weight loss. So 60 minutes a day really is to achieve, or more is what should be happening. The most intensity is actually the most critical factor. The most critical factor for successful aerobic training is properly managed intensity. Okay, that's another thing that's important. And monitoring heart rate provides the most practical way to assess the strenuousness of physical activity. All right. Trainability and genes. So genotype dependency, like I said before, not phenotype, really is not. So phenotype is the way someone looks, but genotype is there are some people who are able to they respond to training more effectively than others, is all it basically comes down to. The limits for developing fitness capacity link closely to natural endowment. So you do have certain people who are more whose bodies react better towards certain types of training than others, and this has been known a long time. So there's a Dr. Pro Olaf Ostrand from Chapter 1. We talked about him, and he prophetically commented the role of genetics in physical performance, and he said that to be an Olympic caliber performer, you must choose your parents wisely, which makes a lot of sense, because that's why I said limits on this is, yes, there are people who are predisposed to being better at sprinting than distance running. You can train somewhat, but the highly elite people may be predisposed to having certain genetics that are more geared to those types of activities, okay, that they're doing. So for individuals, same exercise program, one might show 10 times more improvement than the other. Genetics research, like I said, genotype dependency for much of one's sensitivity in responding to max aerobic and anaerobic power training, including adaptations of most muscle enzymes. And genotype just means it's an allele that they carry, okay, that you may not see, but it's a trait that once they start training, you say, wow, this person reacted really well, and this other person may not. Maintenance of aerobic fitness gains. Aerobic capacity improvements involve somewhat different training requirements than its maintenance, with intensity held constant, frequency and duration of exercise required to maintain certain level of aerobic fitness remain considerably lower than what's required for its improvement. And a small decline in exercise intensity reduces VO2 max, indicating that exercise intensity plays a principal role in maintaining the increase in max aerobic output through training. So basically it's saying that intensity needs to be kept up, okay? Intensity is probably plays the principal role in maintaining the training-induced VO2 max improvements. You had, when you looked at, in one study, healthy young adults increased VO2 max 25% following 10 weeks of interval training by bicycling, running for 40 minutes, 6 days weekly. They then joined one of the two groups that continued exercise for additional 15 weeks, the same intensity and duration, but reduced frequency. Both groups maintained gains in aerobic capacity despite up to 2/3 reducing training frequency. So really, intensity is the most important factor in regards to this. Tapering for peak performance. In most instances, little improvement occurs in their aerobic systems during competitive season. For major competition, athletes reduce their taper training by intensity and or volume. Okay, so what this talks about is that you, for instance, you decrease intensity on sprinting. You're for example, e.g., you're doing 80% of a 1-rep max, so you sprint at 100%, okay, up until about 4 to 7 days before competition. Then within that week, that last week before your competition, you may only do 80% of your 100% max on one sprint, let's say. So you're doing 80% of what you would typically, you're not doing an all-out sprint, but you're doing 80% of that. Then you can look at the volume. So the number of sprints might decrease. Instead of doing 10 sprints, you might do 7, okay? From a physiological perspective, 4 to 7 days probably provides sufficient time to achieve max muscle liver glycogen replenishment, optimal nutrition support, restoration, minimize residual muscle soreness, speed healing, and minor injuries. The reason they do this is because muscle and liver glycogen, they don't want to be depleted for the event that you're going to do, which makes sense. That's why you taper. And then they don't want to have muscle soreness or injuries in that last week before you do the competition. General guidelines for formulating aerobic training program: start slow, allow warm-up periods, so you should have a dynamic stretching first of all, but then also you should have a warm-up period where you're warming the muscles with the blood and things of that nature, so that the musculature you're going to use is ready to move even at a quicker rate. Okay, and then a cool down period. It actually helps so that if you slow down and gradually before stopping, it allows the metabolism to progress towards resting levels, and the gradual cool down prevents the blood from pooling in the large veins of previous active muscles. So, because the venous pulling could cause a decrease in blood pressure and reduce blood flow to the heart and brain, producing dizziness, nausea, and fainting. So, what happens, that can even produce some irregular heartbeats because of this reduced blood flow, blood flow to the myocardium. So, in all reality, you want to make sure that you're moving in the cool down period as well. It can include static stretching, but then you want a cool down period before that. Exercise guidelines for children. So, children should be accumulating 60 minutes or more per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and up to several hours daily of age and developmentally appropriate activities for young children. Some of the child's physical activity each day should be in periods lasting 15 minutes or longer, including large muscle, rhythmic, moderate to vigorous aerobic activities. It's not good to be inactive for long periods of time for anyone, really, children or adults. And elementary school children should participate in a variety of physical activities, various levels and intensities. Makes sense. So, establish training intensity. Intensity must be assessed relatively to stress placed on the aerobic system. Training at a person's VO2 max, training at percentage of max heart rate. Heart rate's pretty easy to do, 220 minus age and years. And you really should be within 60 to 90% of what that is. Okay, so you figure out what that 220 minus your age, 60 to 90%, and then you can put your finger on your carotid artery and see what is your heart rate through 60 seconds or through 15 seconds, and then multiply it times 4, and then you know, am I within my 60 to 90% range? Okay. Training at perception effort, or RPE, which is the Borg scale, and training at the lactate threshold. So you train until you start feeling the burn in your muscles. Okay, the burn in your muscles is the lactate buildup. Okay, it's and so you're getting that acidosis feel, the metabolic acidosis feel, so that you basically have to training at that threshold is beneficial as well, actually, to performance. So one of the things is that you have to, in general, longer duration offsets lower intensity for older and less fit individuals. We also have to remember that more isn't always better, because excessive activity increases chance for sustained bone, joint, muscle injuries. We talked about this with certain things, in that you should have a programmed activity, should be age appropriate, should be based upon someone's fitness level. You have to look whether or not they have underlying health issues. Then we have to look at the Fitts law, which talks about that speed accuracy trade-off, where if we're doing something quickly, okay, we're going to have a trade-off with the reduced accuracy of it. So then it could cause joint problems if the musculature can't uphold the movement that's taking place. Training intensity, this is the Borg scale again, and this is what people basically talk about when they're saying, okay, it's perceived, okay, what do I feel like in regards to the physiological strain, okay? All right. Methods of training: anaerobic, all-out exercise up to 60 seconds. Okay. And this is an anaerobic. Really is your glycolytic system can be up to 90 seconds, and it starts switching over to the aerobic system. Anaerobic training too. Remember, the ATP is about can go. The ATP system is really like what you're using in regards to 1 rep max or vertical jump, and then up to 12 seconds is your phosphocreatine system. Continuous training, long, slow distance training that requires sustained, steady rate aerobic exercise. Interval, specific spacing, high intensity, and rest periods. You're talking about like treadmill sprints where you sprint all out for 10 seconds and then you rest. Okay, then you sprint all out again on the treadmill, then you rest, or you do it outside. Okay, which has shown benefits. You are definitely going to decrease that glycogen reserve, but then it can be with that rest period. The can also be, if you're talking about training in the interval system, you're training within that system that can be where it could be replenished quickly because you're able to rest. So if you have something, let's say like you sprint for a minute, or let's say you sprint for 10 seconds, is the anaerobic the better interval for 10 seconds you sprint. Okay, then you're going to rest for about 30 seconds, and when you do that, you're able to replenish those higher energy phosphates to then sprint again. Okay, that's the thing. So you're dealing with the ATP and phosphate system when you're doing sprints for 10 seconds and things like that. So you can regain those through rest, and there's no real depletion. Now, if you're talking about aerobic, you're talking about glycogen depletion because it's in the muscle, and so that there can be, the effects of that can last a few days, a day or two later. Where if your glycogen is depleted, that may affect your performance. Fartlek training. This is another cool thing. It's called actually fast play, speed play. And speed play, the performer's determining training schema, how it feels at the time, gauging exercise intensity, perceived exertion. But really what's going on is performer determines the schema based on how it feels. The individual provides ideal general conditioning and off-season training, but lacks systematic quantified approaches to interval continuous training. What happens is they alternate fast and slow speeds in fartlek over the both level and hilly landscapes. So they're fartlek, you're running fast and then you're slowing down. You may even sprint within your running, but then you're going up hills, down hills, off road. The different terrain changes. It's kind of a fun type of thing if you think about it, to train that way. Overtraining syndrome. You either can have a sympathetic form, which is the sympathetic hyperexcitability. You have a hyperexcitability, restlessness, impaired exercise performance. You can have this, it's the fight or flight response, and then you can also have the parasympathetic, which is characterized by vagal activity during rest and exercise, which deals more. It's like overreaching is a part of this. It's like overtraining, but it's in shorter duration, which can affect your performance too as well. Okay, common overtraining characteristics: unexplained, persistent poor athletic performance and substantial fatigue, disturbed mood states, persistent muscle joint soreness, insomnia, loss of appetite, weight loss. Okay, and physical performance declines. And that's what we talked about here. I won't go over this with you because I already talked about it. And then exercise training, pregnancy. You have pregnancy. Basically, if you're doing moderate physical activity, then there's no contraindication of exercise during pregnancy. Increased maternal body mass adds considerably to exercise effort and weight bearing. So you have to think about that. You have to think about weight bearing with blood pressure and things like that. But moderate activity is not bad. 30-40 minutes moderate aerobic exercise. Previously active, healthy, low risk woman during an uncomplicated pregnancy does not compromise fetal oxygen supply, because if you're talking about intense activity, it actually you can have damage. Could pose a hazard to the fetus with restricted placental blood flow. In addition, elevated maternal core temp hinders heat dissipation from fetus to the placenta. So this maternal hyperthermia negatively affects fetal development. So you have to think about heat too as well. Aerobic exercise throughout pregnancy accomplishes, I'm glad I didn't go too quickly here, reduces birth weight, reduces weight percentile, reduces offspring's calculated percent body fat and body mass. Another thing too is children of active mothers actually have been shown to score higher on intelligence tests, including superior oral language. Okay, so the benefits to fetal neurological development, increased mental capacity, have linked to one or more of the 5 factors for providing stimulus to create positive benefits with regular physical activity during pregnancy. Intermittent stress, vibration, sound, motion, and accelerated heartbeat. Okay, it's pretty awesome. And they also, offspring of physically active women did not show evidence of a comparative deficit in any of those areas. So there's all, in regards to moderate aerobic exercise, 30 or 40 minutes, there's nothing wrong with that for an uncomplicated pregnancy. Contraindications for exercise during pregnancy: pregnancy-induced hypertension, preterm rupture of membranes, preterm labor during prior or current pregnancy, incompetent cervix, persistent second to third trimester bleeding, intrauterine growth, intrauterine growth, type 1 diabetes, spontaneous abortions have taken place, multiple pregnancies, smoking, excessive alcohol intake, history of premature labor, anemia, which is the lack of iron in the blood, things like that, blood loss, and excessive obesity. Okay, so all right, pretty cool.